You came here thinking I would soothe you, that I would hand you a set of comforting affirmations to silence the storm inside your mind. But what if I told you the truth, that Jung's psychology is not medicine for sleep, but a dangerous awakening? It wasn't comfort he offered, it was confrontation. Not gentle reassurance, but a mirror you may not survive looking into. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Notice what this implies. The tragedies you swear were random, the betrayals you call accidents, the exhaustion you label burnout, they may not be fate at all. They may be patterns you've been unconsciously feeding every single day. And here lies the uncomfortable promise of this lecture. If you dare to listen, if you stay until the end, you will see where your mind is being broken, not by others alone, but by the very spaces you inhabit, without knowing it. Jung discovered 7 psychological environments so toxic they dissolve sanity itself. They aren't places on a map. They are chambers in which your thoughts, emotions, and identity are quietly rearranged. They see you, they shape you, they drain you. You think you're making choices, but in truth, you are being programmed. Jung called this collective possession, when you are no longer an individual soul, but a mask worn by the crowd. Here's the promise. By the end of this journey, you'll recognize these invisible environments in your own life. And recognition is no small thing. Recognition is a weapon. Because once you name the trap, you are no longer its prisoner. So I ask you, are you prepared to lose your illusions? Because today, you will. Every revelation in psychology begins not with theory, but with a person whose suffering could no longer be explained away. In 1961, Carl Jung encountered such a patient, a man who, on the surface, lived a perfectly normal life. He had a career, a family, and no history of madness. Yet, piece by piece, he was unraveling. His thoughts became scattered, his confidence crumbled, and his nights were filled with a terror he could never name. Friends called it stress. Doctors called it fatigue. But Jung knew something more insidious was at work. This man wasn't insane. He was inhabiting environments of the mind that were slowly rewiring his entire being against itself. Jung would later describe these environments as the 7 dangerous places of psychology. Not places in the world, but states of consciousness so toxic that they eat away at identity from the inside out. Let me show you what Jung saw. The patient's first poison was what Jung called the echo chamber. Every day he surrounded himself with people who mirrored his own views back to him, colleagues who shared his political anger, friends who repeated his biases, groups who never questioned his beliefs. At first it felt safe, even empowering, but Jung saw the cost. His patient's mind became brittle, allergic to difference, terrified of contradiction. His critical thinking withered like an unused muscle. Because the echo chamber makes you mentally weak, therefore you become prey to the second trap, the comparison arena. Here the man's worth was no longer measured by his own inner compass, but by the endless ladder of others' successes. Every promotion meant nothing compared to his friend's greater wealth. Every achievement dissolved in the acid of envy. Jung named this the cycle of inflation and deflation. You either feel superior or inferior, but never whole. And when he went to work, he entered what Jung saw as the performance theater, a space where masks are rewarded and authenticity punished. He laughed at jokes he hated, nodded at policies he despised, and wore his professional smile until it became fused to his soul. He came to Jung whispering, "I don't know who I am anymore. The mask has eaten the man." By the time he reached the 4th chamber, silent suffering, his psyche was gasping. Raised in a family that never expressed real love, he had learned that silence meant safety. So he never complained, never asked for help, never revealed that beneath his calm exterior was an ocean of unspoken grief. Jung wrote of such families. They avoid conflict, but in avoiding conflict, they also avoid intimacy. And still it went deeper. The man was caught in the chaos storm, a life so crowded with noise, news, and stimulation that he could no longer hear his own soul. Quiet terrified him, because silence would have forced him to face the abyss he carried within. This chaos made him abandon himself. He entered what Jung called the self-abandonment chamber, where you betray your instincts so many times you stop hearing them at all. He stayed in relationships that drained him. He said yes when everything in him screamed no. And in the end, when Jung asked him what he truly wanted from life, he answered with chilling honesty, "I don't know. I haven't wanted for years." Finally, Jung led him into the darkest place, the shadow basement. This was the space where all the rejected parts of himself, his anger, his fear, his shame, had been locked away. And what Jung discovered was terrifying. What you bury doesn't die. It festers, it grows, and then it emerges through sabotage, rage, and patterns you swear you'll never repeat, until you realize the shadow has been living your life for you. Jung wrote of this man. He succeeded at everything he was told to want, and yet he arrived hollow. The dangerous places had eaten his soul. The story disturbed Jung because it wasn't rare, it was universal. And here is the forbidden truth he uncovered. You may be inhabiting these places every single day, thinking you are simply tired or unlucky, when in fact you are being dismantled from the inside out. Jung's forbidden case study was not about one man's collapse. It was about the machinery that collapses all of us if left unchecked. You see, the psyche is not a single voice. It is a parliament of warring forces, each demanding allegiance. Jung identified three primary actors in this inner theater: the persona, the shadow, and the mechanism that binds them, projection. The persona is the mask you present to the world. Necessary, even useful, it allows you to navigate society, to keep your job, to maintain harmony at the dinner table. But when you mistake the mask for your face, you become hollow. Jung warned that the greatest danger of the persona is identification. The mask must not be confused with the true individuality. Opposite the mask lurks the shadow, everything in you that has been exiled. Your forbidden anger, your hidden envy, your denied desires, your unclaimed brilliance. These are not gone. They live in the basement of your psyche, waiting. And the longer they are denied, the more violent their eventual eruption. Now here is the crucial mechanism: projection. Because the ego cannot bear to face the shadow directly, it hurls it outward. You accuse others of arrogance because you fear your own. You despise the lazy colleague because you repress your need for rest. You worship the saintly friend because you have buried your own capacity for goodness. Jung observed with horror that when projection is absolute, it creates what he called a reality distortion field, a world in which you no longer see people as they are, but as screens for your disowned self. And here lies the inevitability. Because the persona is fragile, it must be defended. Because the shadow is disowned, it must be projected. Therefore, you walk through the world not as an authentic soul, but as a mask polisher and a projection machine. This is why Jung's patients often said, "I don't know who I am." Their lives were being lived by the mask above and the shadow below, with the true self trapped in silence. And when this machinery runs unchecked, it constructs the very dangerous environments we explored in the case study. The echo chamber, the performance theater, the shadow basement, they are not external accidents. They are internal inevitabilities, born of persona, shadow, and projection colliding. Now you begin to see why Jung said, the unconscious, if not made conscious, will rule your life as fate. The dangerous places are not out there. They are the worlds your unexamined psyche creates in here. You may wonder, why not confront the mask directly? Why not tear it off and demand the truth beneath? Jung's answer was clear. Confrontation strengthens defenses. When you accuse, the persona doubles down. When you demand, the shadow retreats deeper into the basement. What you call honesty often becomes nothing more than a new battleground of rationalizations and counterattacks. Because the ego is built to survive, therefore, it resists exposure at all costs. Jung documented case after case where direct challenge only magnified projection. Patients became more certain of their illusions the more they were opposed. But here lies the paradox. A well-placed question does not attack the mask. It invites the psyche to speak for itself. It opens a doorway through which the unconscious leaks into daylight. Unlike confrontation, which triggers the fight-or-flight reflex, a question triggers the narrative reflex, the compulsion to explain, to elaborate, to make sense. And in that elaboration, cracks appear. Think of it this way. A hammer shatters glass, but a tuning fork makes it vibrate until it sings its own fracture. Questions are tuning forks. They create resonance between what the person says and what their unconscious reveals through tone, pause, and contradiction. Jung called this active listening to the unconscious. He believed that if you give the psyche enough space, it cannot help but confess itself. The pause before an answer, the shift in eyes, the overeager smile, these are the micro-revelations of the shadow trying to escape. Because the unconscious leaks through language, therefore questions become surgical tools. They bypass the guard dogs of the persona and summon the very content the ego tries to bury. This is why Jung often advised his students not to lecture their patients, but to ask the kinds of questions that left silence in the room. In silence, the unconscious speaks louder than words. And now, you are ready to hear them. 3 questions, each designed to unmask projection, expose shadow, and reveal the self beneath the mask. Now we arrive at the trap Jung himself designed, not to humiliate, not to corner, but to reveal. 3 questions. On the surface, they look harmless, yet beneath, they are psychological crowbars, prying open the hidden joints between persona and shadow. The first question strikes at the illusion of virtue. Q1. When you disappoint people, which promise do you refuse to break to yourself, and why? This question forces the individual to distinguish between reputation and authenticity. Do they name a true inner value, or do they echo what sounds admirable? Jung warned that the mask always reveals itself in its compulsive need to appear good. Here you find out whether their goodness is lived or performed. The second question dismantles projection. Q2. Tell me about a recent conflict where you were exactly 51% responsible. The demand for majority responsibility shifts the ground. The persona resists because it thrives on victimhood. But the unconscious stirs because only by acknowledging its own contribution can the shadow step into daylight. Jung observed, we meet our shadow most directly in what we accuse others of. This question turns the accusation back onto the accuser. And the third question pierces the victim's story. Q3. What's the story you repeat about your bad luck, and what would change if it weren't true? Here, the psyche's favorite shelter, the myth of fate, is stripped bare. The individual must either admit that their suffering is chosen, or that their entire narrative is a defense against responsibility. Jung called this the compulsion to repeat, the hidden law that drags us back into the same mistakes until we finally see our own hand in them. Together, these 3 questions form what I call Jung's trap. They appear gentle, they appear curious, but in reality, they are surgical instruments. Each bypasses ego defense and forces unconscious content to leak into the room. Because you cannot project and own responsibility at the same time. Because you cannot repeat a story and see through it simultaneously. Therefore, these questions catalyze the one thing the unconscious fears most, consciousness itself. Now, the trap is set. But how you ask them will determine whether truth emerges, or defenses snap shut forever. Jung warned his students, the right question in the wrong spirit becomes violence. The secret is not just what you ask, but how, when, and in what psychological container. First, context. These questions are not weapons for debate, nor tools to win arguments. They are invitations. They must be asked in a frame of shared curiosity. Instead of, "I'll expose you," the energy must be, "I wonder with you." Why? Because the persona resists force, but relaxes in curiosity. When someone feels they are being studied, they recoil. But when they feel they are being witnessed, they soften. Second, tone. Deliver the questions lightly, as though you could set them down and walk away. The shadow senses traps, and if your tone is charged with accusation, it will slam the door. Ask slowly, with genuine neutrality, and then fall silent. Silence is not emptiness, it is pressure. Jung noted that many of his most revealing sessions happened not in words, but in the pauses that followed them. Third, timing. Do not ask these questions in the heat of conflict. Fire meets fire and burns down the bridge. Instead, ask when rapport is present, when the psyche is less defended. Jung observed that insight arises not in the storm, but in the clearing after. A conversation over coffee, a reflective walk, a quiet evening, these are the fertile soils. And finally, one at a time. Do not barrage. Do not demand answers. One question, left to breathe, is often enough to dislodge months of unconscious material. Because questions are not knives, they are mirrors, and mirrors require light. The light comes not from your cleverness, but from your restraint. This is why Jung insisted that the analyst must cultivate patience. The psyche does not reveal itself when commanded. It reveals itself when the right question meets the right silence. So remember, gentle tone, patient timing, curious frame. Only then do the questions open doors instead of building walls. Now, with the method of asking prepared, we can step into the heart of the practice. The deep dives into each of the three questions, what they expose, how to interpret the leaks, and how to separate the shadow's truth from the persona's performance. The first question is deceptively simple. When you disappoint people, which promise do you refuse to break to yourself, and why? At first glance, it sounds like a conversation starter, but beneath the surface, it is a scalpel aimed at the fragile tissue between authentic value and borrowed virtue. Jung observed that most people live inside what he called the persona ideal, an image of themselves stitched together from parental expectations, social approval, and cultural scripts. They confuse this mask with their identity, insisting, "I am honest, I am kind, I am strong," when in fact they are only rehearsing what society demanded they become. So when you ask this question, listen carefully to what emerges. The authentic answer will be grounded, specific, and often costly. Someone might say, "I refuse to betray my commitment to tell the truth, even if it ruins my reputation at work. I lost a promotion last year because I refused to lie for my boss." That is a value lived, not a slogan. The mask answer will be vague, inflated, and costless. "I always put others first. I never lie. I'm always loyal." Notice the absolute language, always, never, and the absence of real-life sacrifice. It is not truth, it is performance. Jung warned that what is noble is often suspect, for it may conceal the shadow. In other words, the brighter the self-description, the darker the unexamined opposite behind it. Here is the diagnostic key. After their answer, ask for a receipt. When did this cost you something? A true value leaves scars. False virtue leaves only words. The micro tells matter as much as the content. Watch for the nervous smile, the eyes darting upward, the rushed tone, as though their unconscious knows it is spinning straw into gold. Watch also for inflation, long speeches stuffed with moral adjectives, as if volume could make up for hollowness. Let me illustrate with a fictional case. Jung once described patients who insisted on their absolute honesty. Yet when pressed, he discovered subtle patterns of evasion, half-truths told to maintain harmony, omissions framed as kindness. Their supposed honesty was not authenticity. It was image management, the need to appear virtuous while avoiding real confrontation. Because the unconscious hates contradiction, Therefore, the false answer must collapse under gentle scrutiny. When you hold silence after asking for receipts, you will often see the flicker of doubt, the pause too long to ignore. That pause is the shadow knocking, and here lies the true power of this first question. It forces a reckoning between who they claim to be and what they actually are when the crowd is watching. If there is alignment, you have found authenticity. If there is only echo, you have found the mask. Jung said, "The mask of perfection is the greatest enemy of the soul." This question tears a seam in that mask. Now we descend deeper. For when values are tested, conflict inevitably follows, and conflict is the arena where projection dances most fiercely. Which brings us to the second question, one that forces the shadow into the open by demanding ownership. The second question is the most uncomfortable of the three. Tell me about a recent conflict where you were exactly 51% responsible. Why 51%? Because it forces the psyche to cross the threshold from victimhood into ownership. To admit majority responsibility is to puncture the fantasy that life only happens to us. Jung wrote that, "We meet our shadow most directly in what we accuse others of." This question reverses the projector's aim. The finger pointed outward must bend back toward the self. Now, how do people respond? The authentic answer is specific, grounded, and marked by humility. You will hear, "I lost my temper with my partner. Yes, she was unkind, but I escalated it. I chose harsh words. I saw her withdraw, and I didn't stop. I created the rupture." The story may be painful, but it is owned. The mask answer is evasive, vague, or performative. "Well, I guess I care too much. My only fault is working too hard. I might be too forgiving." Notice how the admission is secretly a boast. They confess nothing, yet disguise it as humility. The unconscious betrays itself through micro-tells. Watch for sudden tempo shifts, speaking faster as though to outrun the truth. Watch for contempt smirks, or the subtle switch into third-person language. Mistakes were made. These are signs that projection still rules the narrative. Jung warned that projection is not simply a misunderstanding, it is a reality distortion. Once a person has externalized their shadow, they genuinely believe it belongs to someone else. They may describe the cruelty, manipulation, or selfishness of another with such conviction that you too begin to doubt your own perception. That is the power of projection. It recruits. Because projection seduces others into its field, therefore only radical ownership breaks its spell. To say "I was more at fault" is to dismantle the illusion and reclaim energy once wasted on blame. Consider a fictional illustration drawn from Jung's clinical notes. A woman insisted her husband was cold and unfeeling. Yet when asked about her part, she reluctantly admitted that she punished him with silence for days whenever he disappointed her. She accused him of emotional withdrawal, when in fact she was enacting it herself. The moment she owned her 51%, the projection shattered, and for the first time she glimpsed her own shadow in the mirror. This question is merciless because it exposes the core divide. Can this person accept responsibility for their own participation in suffering, or must they forever live as the innocent victim? Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, begins the very moment we claim responsibility for what we once disowned. The 51% rule is not arithmetic, it is initiation, and once ownership is demanded, the next veil falls. For beneath blame lies something older, deeper, the stories we tell ourselves about fate, bad luck, and inevitability. Which leads us to the third question, one that dismantles the myths that keep the psyche trapped in repetition. The third question is the most devastating of all because it rips the mask not from the persona, but from fate itself. What's the story you repeat about your bad luck, and what would change if it weren't true? Everyone carries such a story. People always betray me. I never get the chances others do. Love just isn't for me. At first glance, these tales look like confessions of powerlessness. But Jung uncovered something darker. These are not confessions. They are contracts. He called it the compulsion to repeat. The psyche replays wounds until the unconscious lesson is faced. So long as you insist on your bad luck, you avoid confronting the truth. You are participating in your own suffering. The authentic answer acknowledges the pattern with honesty and curiosity. I say I have bad luck in relationships, but in truth, I ignore the red flags I already sense. If it weren't true that I'm cursed, it would mean I've been choosing the wrong people, and I'd need to choose differently. This is the doorway to liberation. The mask answer clings to the myth. I guess people just envy me. The universe is against me. These are self-protective excuses, preserving the illusion of innocence while ensuring the repetition of pain. The micro-tells betray the story. A sigh that comes before laughter. A glance upward when pressed for examples. The pause that stretches too long. These are the moments when the unconscious wavers between confession and defense. Jung wrote, "We do not solve our problems, we outgrow them." To outgrow is to step beyond the story, to ask, what if it isn't bad luck? What if it's me? This reframing collapses the contract with fate. Because if your suffering is random, therefore nothing can be done. But if your suffering is patterned, therefore it can be interrupted. And interruption is power. A fictional example makes this vivid. Jung once described a man who insisted every boss he worked for was cruel. Yet when asked this question, he admitted he had turned down offers from kinder employers because they seemed too boring. His story of always unlucky with bosses was really a story of his unconscious attraction to domination. Seeing this pattern dissolved it, and with it, decades of self-sabotage. This third question strikes at the very heart of repetition compulsion. It exposes whether a person is willing to surrender the illusion of being cursed, or whether they will cling to it as a shield against responsibility. And with this final key, the triad is complete. Values versus image, ownership versus projection, pattern versus excuse. 3 doors through which the unconscious walks into daylight. But asking the questions is only half the battle. You must also know how to read the answers, not just the words, but the delivery, the silences, the consequences. That is the matrix we now turn to. Jung reminded us, the psyche speaks not only in words, but in slips, silences, and symptoms. If you rely on language alone, you will be deceived. Masks are built of words. To see through them, you need a matrix. Content X delivery X consequence. 1. Content. What they say. This is the surface, the script. It is often rehearsed, polished, borrowed from cultural cliches. Jung warned that the persona excels at content. It can always produce the right answer. That's why we must treat words not as truth, but as raw data. 2. Delivery. How they say it. Hear the unconscious leaks. Listen for latency, the pause before speech. Watch for inflation, too many adjectives, too much moral perfume. Attend to tone. A soft, grounded answer often signals authenticity, while rushed or theatrical delivery hints at the persona scrambling to maintain control. Jung observed that truth is simple, but deception is elaborate. 3. Consequence. What they actually do. This is the ultimate arbiter. If someone proclaims loyalty yet leaves a trail of broken promises, their persona is speaking louder than their soul. Jung insisted, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." Therefore, consequences reveal the alignment or misalignment between mask and reality. Because words can be rehearsed, therefore delivery reveals truth. Because delivery can be faked, therefore consequences must be checked. And when all three converge, authentic content, congruent delivery, and lived consequence, you have found the rarest thing in psychology: integrity. Let me give you an example. Suppose you ask Q1 about values. The person says, "I value honesty, content." But as they speak, their eyes dart away, their tone wavers, delivery. And later, you discover they routinely conceal information at work, consequence. What does the matrix reveal? That their honesty is not a lived value, but an aspirational mask. Another case, you ask Q2 about conflict. They confess, with clear voice and steady gaze, "I was cruel in that argument, I wanted to wound, and I regret it." Content plus delivery. Later, you see them apologizing and repairing relationships, consequence. This is alignment. Shadow acknowledged, persona humbled, self-strengthened. The reading matrix prevents naivety. Without it, you mistake eloquence for truth, charisma for authenticity, or apology for change. With it, you anchor perception in a triangulated field. Jung's clinical genius was not only in asking questions, but in listening with his whole being to the words, the silences, and the lived aftermath. He taught that the unconscious always leaks, but only to eyes trained to see. And yet, there is danger here. To wield this matrix without care is to turn it into a weapon of manipulation. That is why, before we go further, we must lay down the ethical guardrails, the boundaries that prevent this knowledge from corrupting you. Every sharp instrument requires discipline. A scalpel in the hand of a surgeon heals. In the hand of the reckless, it mutilates. The same is true of Jung's questions. Jung himself warned, "Knowledge of the soul is a dangerous weapon if misused." The temptation is real. Once you see how easily the persona cracks, how quickly projection unravels, you may be seduced into using this power for control, subtly bending others, collecting secrets, winning games of dominance. But that path is not individuation. It is inflation, the ego swollen by stolen insight. So here are the guardrails. 1. No diagnosis. These tools are for relational clarity, not for labeling others. You are not a clinician in everyday life. You are a participant. Resist the arrogance of declaring, "I see your shadow." Shadows are revealed, not imposed. 2. Mutuality. Never ask what you are unwilling to answer yourself. Jung insisted that analysis begins with the analyst. If you demand authenticity, first model it. If you press for ownership, confess your own 51%. If you probe for repeated stories, reveal your own myth of bad luck. 3. Contextual consent. These questions belong in spaces of trust, not ambushes. To spring them in arguments is to weaponize them. To offer them in curiosity is to open the possibility of healing. Jung knew the psyche reveals itself when it feels safe, not when it feels cornered. 4. Boundaries of use. Remember that insight is not obligation. To see another's shadow does not mean you must fix it, carry it, or stay entangled with it. Sometimes the most ethical response is withdrawal. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You can see the darkness in another without making it your burden. Because the point is not conquest, but clarity, not to dominate another's psyche, but to ensure that yours remains awake, uncorrupted, aligned. With ethics established, we can now ask, where do people most often misuse these tools? Where does the path toward clarity collapse into confusion? That is where we must examine the common pitfalls. Even with ethics in place, the path remains treacherous. Jung warned that the greatest danger in knowing the unconscious is believing you control it. The following pitfalls are the most common snares that devour seekers who use these tools without vigilance. Pitfall 1. Confirmation hunting. Once you suspect a mask, you may begin searching for evidence to prove yourself right. Every pause becomes guilt, every sigh becomes deception. But projection is a two-way street. You can project suspicion just as easily as another projects innocence. To avoid this, practice the discipline of counter-hypotheses. What else could this silence mean? Without this humility, you mistake your own shadow for someone else's. Pitfall 2. speed-reading souls. The temptation is to believe you can decode someone in a single sitting. You cannot. Jung reminded us that psyche unfolds in spirals, not snapshots. 2 encounters, 3 encounters, sometimes years are needed to reveal the deeper pattern. Rushed judgment is the persona in disguise, whispering, "You already know." Resist it. Truth takes time. Pitfall 3. The hero trap. When you see through another's mask, you may feel the pull to rescue them, to drag them into authenticity, to insist they own what they cannot yet face. But Jung insisted, no one is saved by another's insight. If you play savior, you are still ensnared by their shadow. The true stance is witness, not rescuer. You can reflect truth, but you cannot walk another's path. Pitfall 4. Shadow bounce. Perhaps the most dangerous, using these tools to analyze others while ignoring your own leaks. You spot the inflation in their speech but miss the inflation in your own. You demand their 51% but hide from yours. Jung called this the inflation of the knower, the shadow disguised as enlightenment. The cure is brutal honesty. Run the 3 questions on yourself before you run them on anyone else. Because each pitfall reveals the same truth. The unconscious will not be tamed. It requires humility, patience, and ruthless self-reflection. Once you sidestep these traps, you can begin to wield the questions not as weapons or judgments, but as instruments of practice. And the best way to practice is through guided role-play, scenarios that allow you to see how the persona leaks, how projection dances, and how stories unravel in real time. Now theory must meet flesh. Jung believed that until you experience a truth in relation, it remains only an idea. So let us walk through 3 living scenarios, moments where the persona slips, the shadow trembles, and the unconscious leaks. Scenario A. The workplace predator. Imagine a colleague who always shifts blame and absorbs credit. You ask Q2, "Tell me about a conflict where you were 51% responsible." He chuckles nervously, eyes darting. "Well, I suppose I care too much. I work too hard. That's my fault." Pause here. This is not ownership. It is disguised self-praise. Notice the delivery, too quick, too polished. The shadow has not spoken. The persona still rules. Scenario B, the romantic charmer. A new partner dazzles you with kindness. But you ask Q1, "When you disappoint people, which promise do you refuse to break to yourself?" They answer, "I'd never lie. I'm always honest. Always. Never. Absolutes." Pause here. Ask for a receipt. When did your honesty cost you something? If they fall silent, fidget, or deflect, the mask is exposed. Remember, true values leave scars. Scenario C, the family victim. A sibling insists life has always mistreated them. You ask Q3, "What's the story you repeat about your bad luck, and what would change if it weren't true?" They sigh, then laugh, "That's just my curse. Nothing ever works out for me." Pause here. The laughter masks grief. The sigh betrays recognition. If pressed gently, "But if that story weren't true, what choice would you face?" The shadow edges into daylight. These pause points are crucial. Do not rush past them. Silence is not absence. It is revelation. Jung noted that the psyche often speaks loudest when the tongue falls still. Watch the eyes, the breath, the body. In those gaps, the unconscious strains against its chains. Because words alone deceive, therefore, you must attend to their collapse. And because collapse reveals pattern, therefore practice is your greatest teacher. Each role play sharpens your perception. Each pause point trains your ear not only to content, but to the tremors beneath. Through practice, you begin to see, as Jung saw, the persona rehearsing, the shadow leaking, the projection circling back on itself. And once you see, you cannot unsee. Now the question arises, what about you? If you dare to wield these questions outward, you must first turn them inward. For only the self-tested can stand as witness to another. Jung warned, we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. To interrogate others without first interrogating yourself is hypocrisy. Worse, it is blindness. The 3 questions are not merely tools to unmask others, they are rites of passage for your own soul. So I now turn them back upon you. Do not answer quickly. Let them disturb you. Let silence stretch until something deeper than the persona begins to speak. Q1, values versus image. When you disappoint others, which promise do you refuse to break to yourself? Do not say honesty or kindness unless you can show the scar it left. What vow have you kept at cost? Write it down. And if you cannot name one, admit this. Perhaps you have been living inside a mask that never belonged to you. Q2, ownership versus projection. Recall your most recent conflict. Not an ancient wound, but a fresh one. Ask yourself, in what way was I 51% responsible? Not 10%, not 20%. Majority. What action, word, or silence did I contribute that tipped the scale? Watch your defenses rise. But they started it. But they were crueler. Pause here. This is your shadow writhing. Let it. Then write the sentence you wish you had spoken instead. This is the seed of transformation. Q3, pattern versus excuse. What story of bad luck do you tell most often? I attract the wrong partners. I never get recognition. No one understands me. Now ask, what would it mean if that story were false? What choice would you face if it weren't destiny, but repetition? Jung insisted that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, the story protects you from the pain of responsibility. Strip it away, and freedom appears. But so does terror. Sit with these 3. They are not riddles to solve in minutes, but doors to open across weeks. Each answer will sting, because each answer is a reunion with the parts of yourself you exiled long ago. Because when you demand receipts of yourself, therefore, your integrity strengthens. Because when you own your 51%, therefore, projection dissolves. Because when you abandon your story of bad luck, therefore, fate loosens its grip. This is individuation in miniature, turning questions into mirrors, mirrors into thresholds, thresholds into transformation. But transformation is not sustained by one night of journaling. It requires practice, rhythm, integration. Which brings us to the discipline Jung prescribed, the structured progression that turns fleeting insight into permanent architecture of the soul. Jung warned that fleeting insights are like sparks in the wind. They flare brightly, then vanish unless they are built into ritual. To move from curiosity to transformation, you need practice. That is why I offer you a 21-day integration plan, not as dogma, but as discipline. Week 1, notice. Each day, choose one low-stakes conversation. Ask just one of the 3 questions, not aloud, but silently of yourself as you listen. What value is this person signaling? What 51% might they be avoiding? What story of bad luck are they clinging to? Don't challenge them, don't correct, simply notice. The point of Week 1 is to train perception without interference. Week 2, test. Now begin asking aloud, gently, in safe spaces. 1 question per encounter. Then apply the reading matrix. Content X, delivery X, consequence. Keep a simple log. Did the answer come with inflation? Did the silence speak louder than the words? Did their later actions align? Jung called this tracking the psyche across time, because masks cannot hold forever. Week 3. Decide. With 2 weeks of observation behind you, it is time to act. Sort your encounters into 3 bands. Green, authentic, aligned, trustworthy. Yellow, mixed signals, persona and shadow, both visible. Red, chronic misalignment, refusal of ownership, story locked. Then adjust your boundaries accordingly. Draw nearer to green, hold space for yellow, and distance from red. This is not cruelty. It is psychological economy, allocating your energy where it will not be devoured. Alongside these weekly practices, adopt one daily ritual, 5 minutes of self-reflection. Each night, write down your own 51% from the day, the moment you projected, the story you repeated, the mask you polished. This prevents the knower's arrogance by keeping you tethered to your own shadow, because perception without practice inflates the ego. But perception with discipline becomes wisdom, and wisdom is what Jung called the slow growth of roots. After 21 days, you will not have mastered these tools. You will have internalized them. They will begin to work on you automatically, like a second vision. You will hear inflation in a friend's voice, feel projection in a partner's blame, notice your own excuses before they harden into fate. And this is the true purpose, not to accumulate insight, but to live symbolically. To recognize that every encounter is a mirror, every question a portal, every silence a teacher. But the stakes do not end with you. Individuation is never private. Your transformation reverberates outward into culture itself, and that is where we must now zoom out, from the personal practice to the collective consequence. What happens when not just one person but thousands begin to live this way, asking, noticing, refusing the mask? Jung believed that the transformation of a single psyche ripples outward into the collective unconscious, the great underground river that connects us all. The world hangs by a thin thread, he wrote, and that thread is the psyche of man. Because if the unconscious directs your life as fate, therefore, when enough individuals make it conscious, culture itself begins to shift. Imagine workplaces where the performance theater collapses and authenticity becomes currency. Imagine families where silence no longer strangles intimacy because members name their 51% and end the repetition of generational blame. Imagine relationships no longer shackled by stories of bad luck, but liberated by conscious choice. These questions are not merely personal tools. They are cultural medicine. Each time you unmask yourself, you give others permission to do the same. Each time you resist projection, you dismantle the very mechanism that fuels tribal hatred, scapegoating, and war. Each time you refuse the story of fate, you loosen the grip of history itself. This wasn't about decoding liars. This was about decoding the collective lie, the illusion that masks are safer than faces, that shadows can be buried forever, that fate is stronger than choice. It is not. Jung showed us the opposite. The psyche is destiny until it is made conscious. And so, we return to the beginning. The danger was never that you see too little. The danger was that you might see too much and lose your place in a world built on illusions. But the greater danger, the one Jung would not let you escape, is failing to see it all. The uncomfortable promise has now been fulfilled. 3 questions, 3 doors. If you dare to walk through them, you will find that what was once hidden in others has always been waiting in you. So ask yourself here and now, which of the 3 questions calls your name most fiercely? Begin there. Journal it, speak it, share it. And in doing so, join the long lineage of those who turned the unconscious into firelight, not only for themselves, but for the culture that needed them awake. We began with a paradox that 3 simple questions could dismantle an entire life of illusion. It seemed too small, too ordinary. And yet, you have seen how each question opens a chamber of the unconscious, the persona's mask, the shadow's denial, the fate story's repetition. This wasn't about exposing liars. This was about exposing reality. It wasn't about controlling others. It was about reclaiming yourself. The danger was never that you see too much. The danger was that you fail to build a conscious relationship with what you already see. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." So now the commission is yours. Take the 3 questions and run them first on yourself. Share them with someone you trust, not as interrogation, but as mutual exploration. Begin a 21-day practice, 1 question a day, 1 journal entry at night, 1 commitment to see without flinching. Because every time you ask them, you tear a seam in the mask. Every time you pause for silence, you give the shadow a chance to speak. Every time you notice the story of fate dissolving, you step closer to the self, the undivided center Jung called the goal of individuation. So let us close where we began. The danger isn't that you see what others don't. The danger is that you refuse to live with that sight. Use it as cultural medicine. Use it as firelight. Use it as the doorway into the life you were meant to inhabit. And now choose. Which of the 3 questions will you carry into your next conversation, your next journal page, your next mirror? Share it. Live it. Let it transform you.